In the humid summer of 1867, deep in the quiet farmlands that stretched beyond Sedalia, Missouri, the case of 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell began to haunt the pages of rural history and the private journals of one deeply unsettled physician. The Midwest was still trembling from the aftershocks of the Civil War, its once thriving farming communities now ghostly with absence, widows, orphans, and empty fields where men had marched away and never returned. In that fragile landscape, one boy's presence would become a quiet contagion of fear. Dr. Samuel Harding, a man of science and reason, the region's only formally educated physician, chronicled Timothy's strange behavior in 3 leather-bound journals that would, decades later, be whispered about as the most disturbing case study ever recorded west of the Mississippi. To any stranger passing through, the child appeared harmless enough, pale, polite, deferential in speech, even endearing in his quietness. He was the kind of boy who looked adults in the eye and said, "Yes, sir," or "Yes, ma'am," who never talked back, never asked for more than what was given to him. But to those who lived near him, those who watched him move through their days like a ghost trapped in daylight, Timothy's stillness became something else entirely. Over 6 months, 3 human deaths and the inexplicable slaughter of dozens of farm animals followed in his wake. Accidents, according to the law, but accidents that seemed to orbit him like dark stars around a sun. The official records would be sealed by Sedalia authorities and hidden from public view for more than a century. But Harding's surviving notes, frayed at the edges, ink fading to sepia, speak of a child whose existence challenged the limits of what men of his century could comprehend about evil, nature, and the human mind. Missouri in those years was still a wounded body, its heart beating weakly after years of bloodshed. The Caldwell farm, set 15 miles south of Sedalia in a narrow valley where the morning fog lingered long after sunrise, had once been a place of promise. James and Martha Caldwell, like so many frontier families, had carved their prosperity from the stubborn earth with cattle, corn, and unrelenting labor. But war had taken everything. James died in 1861 at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, leaving his wife to fight the land alone until consumption carried her off in the winter of 1865. Their eldest son, Thomas Caldwell, barely 21 and already exhausted by life, inherited little more than weathered soil, debts, and the lonely task of keeping a dying name alive. When word came that his brother William had perished in the hell of Andersonville prison, leaving behind a widow and a small son, Thomas saw both burden and opportunity. The farm needed help and the boy needed a home. And so in the thaw of early 1866, Timothy Caldwell arrived, a slight fair-haired child with skin so pale it seemed to reject the sun. He carried a small cloth satchel, his worldly possessions contained within, and eyes that unsettled his new family from the moment they met his gaze. His Aunt Sarah Caldwell, a sharp-tongued woman made brittle by years of disappointment, cut his hair close to keep the lice away, and remarked to neighbors that the boy never seemed to flinch at the sound of the scissors, never squirmed or cried as children do. He did his chores without complaint, answered questions with precision, and displayed none of the erratic moods that mark the young. It was that absence of childhood, that strange composure, that drew Dr. Harding's notice when he first encountered the boy in June of that year. The doctor, a veteran of battlefield medicine, prided himself on his ability to read people. He had seen men broken by pain, by fear, by the things they had done to survive the war. Yet the Caldwell boy was unlike anyone he had ever examined. He was perfectly polite, Harding wrote, but in his politeness there was no warmth. His eyes met mine without hesitation, and though his words were correct, his expression was void. It was as though he regarded me as a specimen, a curiosity to be measured and recorded. In a farming community as small as Sedalia's, strange impressions traveled fast. The Caldwells' nearest neighbors, Samuel and Eleanor Patterson, whose property bordered theirs, began to notice oddities of their own. Eleanor would often see Timothy working in the fields from sunup to sundown, his small frame bent over a hoe, or carrying pails of water too heavy for a child his age. She said it was like watching a little machine wound too tight, for he never paused to play, never daydreamed, never even wiped the sweat from his brow. When he did speak, it was with a courtesy that chilled rather than comforted. He worked as though he was trying to learn how to look human, Eleanor told her husband one evening. The animals, too, seemed to sense something she could not name. Her chickens clucked in alarm whenever Timothy came near the fence line, clustering together and refusing to forage until he was gone. "It's as if they know," she whispered. The first death came that August, on a day so hot the air itself seemed to shimmer. Mary Fletcher, a lively 5-year-old with a bright laugh, vanished from her yard near Willow Creek, the shallow stream that wound through several farms, including the Caldwells. It was Timothy who arrived at the Fletchers' door near supper time, his clothes damp, his face pale but composed. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said evenly, "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." A search party formed at once, and the little girl's body was found just as he described, face down in water barely knee-deep. Dr. Harding's examination ruled it a drowning. Tragic but not unheard of in the countryside. Yet the details Timothy provided were unnervingly exact. The precise angle of the girl's arms, the way her dress had snagged on a branch beneath the surface, the faint tint of the water near her cheek. Harding's journal records his unease. No child in shock could recall so much, nor deliver such description without tremor or hesitation. When asked why he had been near the creek, Timothy explained that he had been searching for a lost calf. His uncle confirmed that a calf had indeed gone missing, though it was later found grazing unharmed in a distant meadow, miles from where Mary drowned. At the funeral, Timothy sat motionless beside his aunt and uncle, head bowed in apparent grief. When Mary's father thanked him for finding her, the boy replied with perfect sincerity, "I wish I had found her sooner." But Eleanor Patterson, seated across the aisle, noticed that when the mother wept and fainted against the coffin, Timothy's expression never changed. His lips moved in prayer, but his eyes, those pale, watchful eyes, remained dry, cool, observant, as though he were studying not the dead child, but the mourners themselves. 3 weeks later, death returned. Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant known for his strength and for climbing Devil's Bluff to tend his wild beehives, was found broken at the foot of the cliffs overlooking Willow Creek. Once again, it was Timothy who discovered him. "I saw Mr. Larsson's hat caught on a bush," he told the men who gathered. "I called out, but he didn't answer, so I climbed down to see." Dr. Harding's inspection of the scene suggested that the old man had fallen from the 40-foot bluff and broken his neck. But something about the details felt wrong. The ground around the body was littered with dozens of dead bees, though no hive stood within sight. Larsson had climbed that bluff hundreds of times without a single misstep, and as his neighbor Samuel Patterson said, he could have done it blindfolded. When pressed, Timothy offered a calm, almost reasonable theory. Maybe the bees stung him. He said they get angry when you disturb them. Harding accepted the explanation publicly, but recorded his doubts privately. The bees had died in a tight cluster directly around the body, as though they had perished at the same moment as the man himself. By autumn, whispers had begun to circulate. Livestock turned up dead with no sign of illness or predator. The Pattersons' cattle refused to drink from the creek where Mary had drowned, and whenever Timothy appeared in town, with his pale skin, his too polite smile, his eyes that seemed to study everything but reveal nothing, conversations faltered, and men looked away. Dr. Harding's later notes spoke of a growing sense that the boy did not merely witness tragedy, but invited it, that some unfathomable shadow clung to him. "He is polite to perfection," the doctor wrote, "but I believe his courtesy is mimicry, a learned mask. I have come to fear that what speaks through that child's mouth is not innocence, but something ancient, intelligent, and cold." The physician's final journal ends abruptly in November of 1867. The last line scrawled across the page in trembling ink. "If there is evil in this world without cause or origin, it wears the face of a boy named Timothy Caldwell." If the old man had truly disturbed a hive at the top of the bluff, Dr. Harding reasoned, there would have been visible evidence of bees along his path of descent, a scattering of stings, agitated hives, or signs of a swarm driven into chaos. Instead, what he found was far stranger. The bees appeared to have gathered unnaturally around the impact site, as though drawn there by some invisible force. When Harding climbed to the top of the bluff to examine the hives himself, he found them completely intact, and undisturbed. The bees were busy and calm, humming softly among the late summer wildflowers, showing none of the aggression or frenzy typical of a recent disturbance. The discovery left the physician uneasy. It was another piece of an increasingly puzzling pattern, a series of tragedies orbiting around the young boy, Timothy Caldwell. That illusion of coincidence shattered entirely with the third death. In September of 1866, 6-year-old Jacob Mills vanished while playing near the woods that bordered his family's small cabin. The community rallied immediately, combing the forest for days with torches and dogs, but the dense undergrowth and uneven terrain thwarted their efforts. Timothy Caldwell, now a familiar presence in every communal effort, eagerly joined the search. Despite his youth, he demonstrated remarkable stamina and an uncanny familiarity with the woods, moving with quiet confidence through terrain that even seasoned hunters avoided. When asked how he had come to know the land so intimately, Timothy explained in his calm, matter-of-fact way that he often explored during his free time, gathering herbs and useful plants for his aunt. On the fourth morning, just after dawn, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin, his clothes soiled and his face pale but composed. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's exhausted father. He led a group of men to a spot half a mile north of the cabin, where an old, partially hidden well lay buried beneath logs and brush. From within they heard faint cries. Jacob Mills was found at the bottom, barely alive. Dr. Harding was summoned immediately, but despite desperate efforts, the boy succumbed to dehydration and exposure within hours of his rescue. In his journal that night, Harding wrote, "The child had been at the bottom of that well for nearly 4 days." The fact that young Caldwell was able to locate him in so obscure a location raises troubling questions. How extensive is the boy's knowledge of this terrain? What else might he know that others do not? During Jacob's final hours, Timothy sat quietly in a shadowed corner of the cabin, while the Mills family prayed and wept around the dying child. At first, Harding assumed the boy was praying as well. His lips moved, his hands clasped, but as the doctor watched more closely, he realized Timothy's gaze was fixed intently on Jacob, not with compassion or fear, but with the detached focus of a scholar studying a specimen. He seemed to be silently cataloging every physical detail, the erratic breathing, the paling skin, the way Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness. When the boy finally died, Timothy's expression didn't waver. There was no grief, no surprise. If anything, Harding thought he glimpsed a faint, almost imperceptible satisfaction. After the funeral, Harding made an excuse to visit the site of the old well. He couldn't explain the compulsion, only that something about it felt wrong. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that the fallen logs and branches obscuring the well's mouth had not landed randomly, as everyone had assumed. They were placed with meticulous precision, forming a convincing camouflage that would make the well nearly impossible to find unless one knew exactly where to look. Harding's medical training told him to trust patterns, not intuition. Yet what he saw suggested deliberate concealment. The implication was horrifying. Jacob Mills hadn't simply fallen. Someone had placed him there and hidden the location until rescue was impossible. That night, Harding began keeping a secret journal devoted solely to Timothy Caldwell. The boy's intelligence, composure, and proximity to every tragedy could no longer be ignored. But suspicions, however dark, were not evidence, and Harding knew that in a close-knit, grieving community, accusation without proof would destroy his credibility. Outwardly, Timothy appeared the perfect child, dutiful, courteous, devout. He attended church each Sunday, kneeling beside his aunt and uncle with solemn reverence, reciting prayers in an even voice. On the farm, he worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk, performing tasks beyond his years with mechanical precision. Neighbors praised his politeness, his quiet diligence, his respectful manner toward elders, and crucially, Timothy had plausible reasons for his presence at every misfortune. He had been searching for a lost calf when he found Mary Fletcher, walking home from town when he discovered Henrik Larsson's hat, volunteering like any good citizen in the search for Jacob Mills. But Harding had seen men like Timothy before, not in children, but in soldiers who had survived the horrors of battle, only to become detached from the humanity around them. There was a certain emptiness in their eyes, a chilling calm when confronted with death. They spoke of violence not with remorse but with curiosity. Timothy displayed the same traits, an unnatural serenity in the face of suffering, a fascination with mortality that felt less emotional than analytical. By October of 1866, Harding's quiet investigation had become systematic. Under the guise of routine medical visits, he traveled from farm to farm, gathering accounts of strange animal deaths and unexplained accidents. The stories formed a grim mosaic. Livestock across the county were dying, not from illness but from injuries that seemed deliberate. Chickens were found each morning with their necks broken cleanly, too precisely to be the work of foxes or hawks. Pigs bore deep wounds that later festered. Horses went lame from injuries that defied common sense. The pattern tightened around the Caldwell property. Eleanor Patterson, a widow who lived half a mile away, told Harding that she had lost 17 chickens in 2 months. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "They're killed 1 or 2 at a time, always at night and always in the same way. My husband used to hunt foxes. I know what a fox kill looks like. This isn't it. It's too neat, too deliberate." Harding examined the carcasses himself and found she was right. The force applied was precise, directed at a specific joint in the neck, as if executed by someone who understood anatomy. Other farmers reported equally strange losses. James Wickham's calves had died by what he called freak accidents, tangled fatally in their tethers, or caught in fences in ways that defied logic. Robert Dunham's prized bull had fallen into a narrow ditch and shattered its leg despite being sure-footed. In each instance, Timothy had been seen nearby, never directly involved, always polite and helpful, yet always present. Wickham remembered seeing the boy walking along his fence line that very morning, waving and greeting him respectfully, as though nothing could be more ordinary. Back at the Caldwell farm, Harding began to study Timothy more closely during his regular checkups. The boy always lingered in the room when the doctor treated his aunt or uncle, observing the procedures with an unsettling focus. His questions were calm, articulate, and disturbingly specific. "How do you know if someone's really dead?" he asked one afternoon, his tone conversational, almost casual. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping." Harding asked what made him curious about that, and Timothy replied that he wanted to know how to help in case of an accident. "Uncle Thomas says I need to be prepared if something happens while we're alone on the farm." It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't soothe Harding's unease. The boy's interest in death was not emotional, it was technical. He asked how long it took a person to die from different wounds, what signs to watch for, and whether pain or silence meant the end was near. To test him, Harding began offering false information, telling Timothy that certain wounds were always fatal when they were not, or that specific symptoms pointed to causes he knew were wrong. The boy never contradicted him aloud, but the look in his eyes told Harding that he recognized each lie, filing away the falsehoods in that precise, calculating mind. It was not the curiosity of a child eager to learn. It was the silent analysis of a predator studying his prey. Dr. Harding soon realized that Timothy never openly corrected the false medical statements he introduced into their conversations, but the boy's silence was deceptive. He seemed to store every fragment of information in his memory with perfect precision, as though cataloging facts for future use. There was something meticulous about the way he listened, an intent focus that felt less like curiosity and more like study. What disturbed Harding most, however, was Timothy's response to his stories of battlefield medicine. The doctor sometimes shared these tales with children to impress upon them the realities of suffering and the preciousness of life. But with Timothy, the effect was reversed. While other youngsters winced or turned away when he described amputations performed without anesthesia, or men screaming as bullets were cut from their flesh, Timothy leaned forward, his pale eyes wide and unblinking. He asked detailed clinical questions about the soldiers' wounds, their blood loss, and how long they survived after certain injuries. "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" Timothy once asked with unsettling politeness. "Or were they too hurt to make noise?" The question, delivered in his soft and even tone, sent a chill down Harding's spine that he would never forget. By November of 1866, the doctor's unease had grown into grim obsession. He had filled nearly 2 journals with observations and analysis, each entry painting a clearer picture of the strange child who lived on the Caldwell farm. The portrait that emerged was chilling, a boy who possessed an adult's comprehension of death and suffering, yet none of the empathy or moral awareness that tempered such knowledge in grown men. Harding was certain that Timothy's calm exterior concealed something predatory and inhuman, but suspicion was not the same as proof. Without evidence, his claims would be dismissed as delusion. He needed something tangible, something undeniable, if he hoped to protect the people of Sedalia from what he now believed was a monster wearing the skin of a child. That opportunity presented itself when Thomas Caldwell injured his back during the fall harvest. The accident left the man bedridden for several weeks, requiring daily medical visits from Dr. Harding. These visits granted the physician unprecedented access to the household and to Timothy. Under the pretense of routine conversation, Harding began to probe deeper into the boy's mind, asking open-ended questions, steering their talks toward topics of pain, death, and nature. The answers he received exceeded even his darkest expectations. Timothy spoke candidly about catching animals in the woods, about watching how they reacted to fear and injury. His tone was matter-of-fact, not cruel, as though describing farm chores rather than acts of deliberate torment. Through careful questioning and inference, Harding realized that Timothy had been performing experiments on living creatures, systematic studies of pain and endurance that displayed both curiosity and calculation. The boy mentioned a cave during one of their conversations, an isolated place where he liked to think and be alone. The words lingered with Harding, gnawing at him until one cold afternoon. He followed the boy's vague directions and located the site. What he found there ended any hope that his suspicions might be exaggerated. Inside the narrow limestone hollow lay a collection that could only be described as a private laboratory of cruelty. The walls and floor were littered with small bones, carefully sorted by type and size. Rough tools, knives fashioned from sharpened metal scraps, fragments of glass, and bent nails, lay arranged on a plank that served as a crude work table. Scattered across the dirt were dozens of pages torn from a school primer, each bearing drawings and notes written in Timothy's precise, even handwriting. The drawings were what haunted Harding most. Rendered with uncanny skill for a child, they depicted rabbits, squirrels, birds, and other small animals in various stages of dissection. Each illustration was accompanied by notations describing the subject's behavior, the duration of its suffering, and the method by which it ultimately died. One page, showing a rabbit with its eyes missing, carried the line, "Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. There was no anger or frenzy in the handwriting, only the cool detachment of an observer recording results. It became clear that the accidental livestock deaths reported on nearby farms were not accidents at all. Timothy had merely been expanding his experiments to larger organisms, testing his methods with growing precision. Then Harding found a stack of newer drawings that froze the blood in his veins. These did not depict animals but people. The figures were crudely shaded yet unmistakable. Mary Fletcher lying by the creek, her small body twisted unnaturally. Henrik Larson at the base of Devil's Bluff, bees sketched around him in a macabre halo. Jacob Mills curled at the bottom of a well, annotated with comments on dehydration, fatigue, and the effects of isolation. The realization hit Harding like a physical blow. Timothy had not simply witnessed these deaths, he had orchestrated them. He had planned, executed, and documented each as part of a series of cold, deliberate experiments. The scale of his intellect and the depth of his absence of empathy defied comprehension. Dr. Harding gathered what evidence he could from the cave, concealing the drawings and notes beneath his coat, though he knew the manner of their discovery might render them inadmissible. As a physician, he was bound by law and ethics, but as a man he could no longer ignore what he had seen. The notion that an 8-year-old boy could possess the mind of a remorseless killer was beyond the imagination of most people in 1866. The term psychopath did not yet exist. Society still believed that evil required corruption or temptation. A child, it was said, was born innocent. Sin entered only through environment or neglect. To claim that wickedness could be innate, that a child might be born devoid of conscience, was to border on heresy. Harding knew that if he presented his findings as they stood, he would be dismissed as a man unhinged by war and grief. Timothy would be pitied as a traumatized orphan, and the killings would continue. So he chose a different course. He decided to confront Timothy directly. The confrontation took place on a gray November afternoon. Harding arrived at the Caldwell farm under the guise of checking Thomas's back, and asked the boy to accompany him to the far pasture to inspect the livestock. The air was cold and heavy with mist, the grass brittle beneath their boots. When they were out of earshot of the house, Harding stopped and turned to face him. "I know about the cave," he said quietly. "I've seen what's inside." Timothy did not flinch. His expression remained calm, curious even, as the doctor described the drawings, the bones, the notes written in his small, tidy hand. When Harding finished, the boy simply looked up at him and said, "You're not going to tell anyone." It was not a question, nor a plea. It was a statement uttered with absolute certainty. Harding's stomach turned. "And why wouldn't I?" he asked. Timothy smiled faintly, the first true smile Harding had ever seen on his face. "Because no one would believe you," the boy said softly. "And because you're curious about what I'll do next." The words struck with surgical precision. The child was right on both counts. Harding could not deny the grim fascination that mingled with his horror, the same morbid curiosity that had driven him to study the anatomy of the wounded in the war. Here stood a specimen unlike any he had ever encountered, a living embodiment of malice without motive, intelligence without empathy. "How long have you been doing this?" Harding asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since I was 5, Timothy replied with the same casual tone one might use to discuss chores. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects, then mice, then bigger things. I wanted to see how they changed when they were hurt." He paused, then added with eerie frankness, "And the people who died, they were experiments too. I wanted to see if people would react the same way as animals. They mostly do, but they understand more. That makes it interesting." A cold wind swept across the pasture, rustling the dead grass. Harding's breath caught in his throat. "And what are you planning to do next?" he asked. Timothy looked thoughtful, his small brow furrowed in contemplation. "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely," he said at last. "Someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late." The implication was unmistakable. Timothy was planning to kill his aunt and uncle. Harding felt the world tilt beneath him. He realized he might have only hours before the boy acted on his plan. That night, shaken but resolute, he rode into Sedalia to meet with Sheriff William Crawford, a veteran of the Union Army known for his level head and unwillingness to indulge in superstition. The sheriff listened in silence as Harding laid out his case, his journals, his observations, the sketches and notes from the cave. He avoided speculation, presenting only verifiable facts, the pattern of deaths, the boy's unnatural knowledge of anatomy, the physical evidence linking him to the incidents. When Harding finished, Crawford remained silent for a long time, staring at the flickering lamp between them. Finally, he spoke in a low, steady voice. "If what you're telling me is true, Doctor," he said, "then we're not dealing with a child. We're dealing with something else entirely." Most importantly, Dr. Harding revealed that Timothy had explicitly stated his intention to kill his aunt and uncle, a confession that could not be ignored under any circumstances. Regardless of the boy's age or apparent composure, such a declaration carried with it a gravity that demanded immediate action. When Harding presented his findings, along with the disturbing sketches and the details of Timothy's conversations, Sheriff Crawford studied the material in silence for a long moment. His face, hardened by years of service and the memory of war, tightened with visible discomfort as he examined each page. "Even if half of what you're telling me is true," he finally said, setting down the papers with deliberate care, "we can't arrest a child based on drawings and suspicions alone, but we can keep him under watch, and we can be ready to act the moment he tries something." There was no trace of doubt in his voice, only grim resolve. As he looked again at Timothy's anatomical sketches, Crawford admitted that, in all his experience as a Civil War veteran, He had never encountered such morbid precision. The boy's renderings of human musculature, bone structure, and wound patterns went far beyond the innocent curiosity of a child. For several hours, Crawford and Harding worked together to devise a strategy, something that could neutralize the danger without causing panic in the community. The sheriff summoned 3 of his most trusted deputies, men who had served with him during the war, and who, like him, understood the necessity of calm resolve in moments of crisis. Together, they formed a plan. Dr. Harding would visit the Caldwell farm under the guise of a routine medical check, carrying laudanum to administer for Thomas Caldwell's persistent pain. In truth, the dosage would be calculated to leave both Thomas and Sarah heavily sedated, unable to move or respond quickly should Timothy decide to act. Meanwhile, Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would conceal themselves at strategic points around the property, close enough to intervene at the first sign of violence, yet far enough to remain unseen by the boy, whose perception and cunning had proven exceptional. Every detail was considered, every contingency prepared. The plan went into motion the following morning. As Dr. Harding guided his buggy down the familiar dirt road leading to the Caldwell homestead, a sense of unease crept steadily through him. The day was clear and still, yet something felt profoundly wrong. The usual morning sounds that filled the farm, the rhythmic cluck of chickens, the squeals of pigs in their pens, the distant call of birds, were conspicuously absent. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness that made his pulse quicken. Before he could dismount, Timothy appeared in the doorway, standing perfectly still, framed by the shadows of the house. His pale blue eyes followed the doctor's movements with the sharp intensity of a predator assessing prey. Though dressed in his usual work clothes, there was something deliberate in his appearance. His sleeves were rolled neatly past his elbows, and his hands, Harding noticed, were freshly scrubbed so thoroughly that the skin was pink, as though in preparation for work that required perfect cleanliness. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his tone polite, almost cheerful, though beneath the civility there was a tremor of barely contained excitement. "I've been waiting for you." The simple statement chilled Harding to his core. The phrasing was not casual. It carried the weight of intent. The boy had been expecting this visit, perhaps even orchestrating it as part of his own design. Inside the house, the atmosphere was no less disturbing. The doctor moved quickly to the Caldwell's bedroom and found Thomas and Sarah lying peacefully side by side, as if in deep sleep. But as he approached, his trained eye caught the pallor beneath their skin, the unnaturally shallow rhythm of their breathing. They were not merely asleep, they were drugged. "What did you give them?" Harding asked quietly, not turning around, aware that Timothy was standing just behind him. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy replied, his voice calm and almost proud. "There are so many interesting plants growing around here. Some of them have very useful properties." The boy's phrasing was meticulous, as if chosen to provoke thought rather than reveal guilt. Harding checked their pulses, weak but steady. Whatever Timothy had used, he had dosed it with precision. They were alive but utterly helpless. "They won't wake up for several hours," Timothy added conversationally. "That should give us plenty of time to talk without interruption." What followed was not a conversation in any ordinary sense. It was a revelation of pure, methodical horror. Timothy spoke with the calm assurance of a lecturer explaining a medical theory, describing in exacting detail the nature of his experiments. He spoke of the sensations of drowning, of suffocation, of starvation, as though recounting scientific observations rather than acts of brutality. "Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually quite slow," he said matter-of-factly. "Everyone thinks it's quick, that people just sink and vanish, but that's not how it happens. They fight for air, they gasp, and then there's this pattern, a sort of rhythm before they stop moving. It took nearly 3 minutes before she stopped struggling." Harding felt his blood turn cold. "You held her under the water?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Timothy nodded eagerly, his eyes shining. "She was playing by the creek," he explained. "I told her there was a pretty stone at the bottom. When she bent over to look, I just pushed her head down and held it there. She was small, it didn't take much strength, but she fought longer than I expected. That's when I realized that people are harder to kill than animals. They don't give up easily," the boy went on without pause, Henrik Larsson was more complicated, he admitted. I couldn't overpower him, so I had to be creative. He always checked his hives on Thursday mornings, so the night before, I loosened the stones near the edge of the bluff. Then I gathered bees into a cloth bag. When he came up to the hives, I threw the bag at him and shouted that the swarm was attacking. He panicked and stumbled right over the edge, just as I planned. Timothy's tone was almost gleeful. The fall killed him instantly. Exactly as I calculated. Dr. Harding could scarcely breathe, but Timothy continued, his voice smooth, composed, almost proud of his reasoning. Jacob Mills was different, he said. I didn't kill him right away. I wanted to see what would happen if someone died slowly, over several days. I told him I'd found baby raccoons in the woods. He followed me without question. I helped him climb down into the well. Then I covered the opening. I brought him water every day, just enough to keep him alive, not enough to help him recover. He lasted 4 days. By now, Harding understood the full scope of Timothy's madness and his intent. The boy was no longer speaking hypothetically. His next victims were in the very house with them. What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle? Harding asked. Timothy smiled, a broad, chilling smile that showed the depth of his satisfaction. That's where you come in, Doctor, he said softly. All my previous experiments were with people who didn't understand what was happening to them. But you understand life, death, and the space in between. That makes you the perfect subject for something new. As he spoke, Timothy began gathering objects around the room. A coil of rope from the barn, a heavy candlestick, several sharp kitchen knives, arranging them neatly on a table as though preparing surgical instruments. I want to see what people do when they know they're going to die, he said with unnerving calm. Do they fight? Do they sacrifice themselves for others? Or do they run? That was the final warning. Dr. Harding drew the pistol from his medical bag and leveled it at the boy. Step away from the knives, Timothy, he commanded. The boy regarded the weapon with interest rather than fear. That's a Navy Colt, isn't it? He asked as if discussing a museum piece. How many bullets does it hold? 6, Harding answered reflexively, then realized his mistake. Timothy's expression brightened with realization. 6 bullets, he said softly, and 6 people to protect. Yourself, my aunt, my uncle, and the 3 men waiting outside. That means no room for error. He stepped forward, his voice lowering to a hypnotic murmur. You want to know how I became what I am? You want to understand whether I was born like this, or whether something made me this way. You want to know if there are others, people who hide it better, who look just like everyone else. Each statement struck like a blade of truth. Timothy was not only dangerous, he was perceptive enough to weaponize understanding itself. The moment broke when Timothy advanced toward his unconscious uncle, rope in hand. Harding moved to stop him, but the boy turned with startling speed, slashing the doctor's arm with a knife. The struggle that followed was brief but ferocious. Despite his size, Timothy fought with the skill and desperation of someone well-practiced in violence. Each movement deliberate, each strike purposeful. The doctor realized with dawning horror that the boy had prepared for this moment as carefully as he had prepared for every other death. The boy was smaller and physically weaker than Dr. Harding, yet he moved with a speed and precision that belied his age. Every strike, every motion was measured, deliberate, and disturbingly calculated, anatomically precise in a way that revealed his extensive morbid study of the human body. Harding managed to seize Timothy's wrist and twist sharply until the knife clattered to the floor. But before the doctor could react, the boy produced another blade from within his clothing. It was immediately clear that Timothy had come prepared. He had hidden multiple weapons around the house, each placed where it could be reached in an instant. The sound of their violent struggle shattered the heavy silence of the farmhouse, summoning Sheriff Crawford and his deputies from their concealed positions outside. The men burst through the back door with weapons drawn, finding a scene of chaos. Dr. Harding wrestling with the boy in the center of the room, while Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lay motionless in their bed, still under the effects of Timothy's drugged herbs, oblivious to the battle raging only a few feet away. Deputy Mitchell lunged forward and managed to restrain Timothy after a brief but fierce struggle, forcing him to the floor while the others secured the area. Harding, bleeding from a shallow cut along his forearm, rushed to check on the unconscious Caldwells. Their pulses were weak but steady, alive, though barely spared from whatever fate Timothy had planned. As the adrenaline of the moment subsided, the boy sat calmly against the far wall, his clothes torn, his hair disheveled, and his face streaked with dirt and blood. Yet his eyes, the same pale glacial blue that had unsettled Harding from the beginning, remained unnervingly tranquil. There was no fear, no shame, not even anger, only an expression of detached curiosity, as though Timothy were the one observing an experiment rather than the subject of it. "You can't prove anything," he said coldly as the deputies tied his hands with coarse rope. "Nobody will believe that a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford regarded him with a mixture of disgust and reluctant fascination. "Maybe not," he admitted grimly, "but we don't have to prove everything. Trying to murder your own family is more than enough to see you locked up no matter how old you are." At this, Timothy's mouth curved into a faint smile, the same eerily genuine expression Harding had seen before, the smile that seemed utterly detached from any true emotion. "You won't hang me," Timothy replied, his voice steady, almost amused. "I'm too young, too valuable. Someone will want to study me instead." The confidence in his tone sent a chill through everyone present. The boy was partially right. What followed his arrest would test the limits of the county's legal and moral systems. When Sheriff Crawford presented the evidence, Timothy's drawings, notes, and Harding's testimony, to the county prosecutors, he encountered the exact resistance Harding had warned him about. The officials dismissed the materials as the disturbed expressions of a traumatized child still grieving his parents' deaths. The bizarre series of accidents and fatalities surrounding him were attributed to tragic coincidence and misfortune, while Timothy's presence at each scene was written off as an unfortunate pattern born of his eagerness to help. Yet the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell could not be explained away so easily. 3 law enforcement officers had witnessed Timothy's direct assault, his clear and deliberate effort to kill 2 unconscious adults. Even the most skeptical observers could not pretend that such an act was anything less than monstrous. The problem, however, was one of law. In 1867, Missouri had no legal precedent for handling a child of such nature. Too young for adult prosecution, yet far too dangerous for the orphanages or reformatories meant for wayward youths. The case drew unprecedented attention from doctors, judges, and scholars throughout the region. Some saw in Timothy a new kind of criminal mind, one that defied moral comprehension. Others viewed him as the tragic byproduct of trauma and neglect. After weeks of debate, a compromise was reached. Timothy Caldwell would not face a criminal trial. Instead, he would be remanded to the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, where he would be evaluated, studied, and treated by the most progressive alienists available. It was a decision that satisfied no one, neither those demanding punishment nor those seeking understanding. Dr. Harding personally volunteered to escort Timothy to the hospital, both to ensure his safe confinement and to continue observing him under controlled conditions. He remained at the facility for 3 months, keeping exhaustive notes that would later form one of the earliest and most unsettling case studies of antisocial behavior in children. At first, Timothy adapted quickly to life inside the hospital's stone walls. He presented himself as an obedient, remorseful patient, crying convincingly during sessions, apologizing for his past deeds, and expressing gratitude to those who showed him kindness. Several nurses and attendants believed he was making genuine progress, but Harding, ever the cautious observer, saw through the performance. He realized that Timothy's apparent emotional breakthroughs were not expressions of growth. They were rehearsals, carefully measured imitations designed to elicit specific responses. Harding's notes described the boy as a creature of extraordinary intelligence, but complete emotional vacancy. "The subject displays remarkable cognitive abilities," he wrote, "coupled with an utter absence of authentic feeling. He has learned to reproduce human emotion with such precision that even experienced observers are deceived. But the performance is hollow, an echo of life without substance. Timothy understood happiness as the expression people wore when they wished to prolong pleasure, and sadness as the mask used to attract sympathy. He could mimic these expressions perfectly without understanding them. To him, emotion was simply another form of data, a tool to manipulate others. As the weeks passed, Timothy's conversations grew darker. Believing he had earned Dr. Harding's trust, he began to share ideas for future experiments, each one more elaborate and horrifying than the last. In private reports, Harding wrote that the boy had developed intricate plans to test human reactions to fear, pain, and isolation. His scenarios involved both psychological torment and physical harm, executed with the detached creativity of a true scientist. If allowed to mature, Harding warned confidentially, he would become one of the most dangerous minds in American history. Timothy remained in the hospital for 18 months, during which time a series of troubling incidents occurred. Several patients died under mysterious circumstances that were officially ruled as natural causes, but bore the unmistakable pattern of Timothy's calculated methods. 3 elderly inmates suffered sudden heart failure after prolonged interactions with the boy, though all had been stable beforehand. 2 younger patients were gravely injured in apparent accidents, both in areas where Timothy had been seen earlier that same day. Even more chilling were the whispered accounts from patients who claimed to awaken in the night to find Timothy standing silently beside their beds, watching them with unblinking eyes. The staff, too, began to suffer. Nurses reported vivid nightmares after tending to Timothy, dreams filled with scenes of violence that mirrored his past crimes. 2 attendants requested immediate reassignment, insisting that they felt constantly observed, even when the boy was confined. Then came the most alarming discovery. Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, a visiting psychiatrist from Boston brought in for her expertise, found that Timothy had been keeping a secret journal. He had convinced one of the nurses to provide him paper and pencil under the pretense of therapeutic writing. On the surface, the entries appeared innocent, childlike reflections on remorse, recovery, and hope. But Dr. Fitzgerald, trained in the cryptographic techniques used by European alienists, suspected more. When she analyzed the writing, she uncovered an intricate cipher hidden within the text. Decoded, the journal revealed the chilling truth. Timothy had been meticulously studying the hospital itself, its routines, staff schedules, security weaknesses, and using his confinement as a laboratory for manipulation. Day 47, one entry read, "Dr. F believes my tears today were genuine." Her response indicates increasing trust and reduced suspicion. Estimated 3 more weeks before she allows physical proximity during sessions. It was a map of deceit. Once discovered, the hospital tightened security around Timothy, restricting his movement and contact. But the boy adapted instantly, shifting focus from manipulation to escape. And in the summer of 1868, that is precisely what he did. One morning, guards found his bed empty and the window bars loosened. Not broken, but carefully removed and replaced to conceal the tampering. The official investigation concluded that Timothy had escaped during a routine transfer between buildings, though the details never made sense. Dr. Harding, who had by then left the hospital, was convinced that the escape had been planned for months, perhaps years, a final act of genius from a mind that understood control better than anyone alive. Timothy Caldwell had vanished into history, leaving behind only questions, and a trail of horror that would haunt Missouri for generations. The boy had shown an extraordinary degree of patience and calculation throughout his confinement, and it soon became evident that his disappearance was no impulsive act, but rather the result of months, perhaps even years, of meticulous preparation. The evidence uncovered in the wake of Timothy's escape suggested that he had been subtly manipulating the staff of the Missouri State Hospital far more effectively than anyone had previously imagined. Guards who had once prided themselves on their discipline now admitted to small acts of leniency, granting him slightly longer walks in the exercise yard, permitting additional reading materials, or allowing inconsequential deviations from his daily routine. Individually, these exceptions seemed harmless, even compassionate. Yet when viewed together, they painted a chilling picture of a mind that had engineered a perfectly timed opportunity for freedom. Dr. Harding, in his final report on the case, wrote with grim clarity. He spent a year and a half studying that institution, its schedules, its architecture, its inhabitants. By the time he acted, he understood the psychology of every person who worked there better than they understood themselves. His escape was not an act of desperation, but the inevitable conclusion of a carefully executed plan. In the months following Timothy's vanishing, and indeed throughout the remainder of his life, Dr. Harding continued to receive and collect reports of mysterious deaths and unexplained accidents scattered across the Midwest. Each incident bore unsettling similarities to the patterns of behavior Timothy had once demonstrated: meticulously staged accidents, unexplained disappearances of small animals, showing signs of systematic mutilation, and, several cases, the unsettling presence of a young boy who appeared unusually intelligent, articulate, and helpful. These reports, though unconfirmed, began to form a haunting mosaic, a suggestion that Timothy had not only survived, but continued to refine his methods with each passing year. By this time, he would have been older, stronger, more capable, and infinitely more dangerous. His rigorous study of human behavior, combined with a total absence of empathy or moral restraint, had turned him into something unprecedented in American criminal history. Dr. Harding devoted the rest of his career to understanding what Timothy represented, filling hundreds of pages in his private journals with case studies, reflections, and theories. When those journals were discovered after Harding's death in 1891, they revealed an obsessive, lifelong pursuit of a truth that refused to be defined. The entries documented possible sightings of Timothy, descriptions of murders and accidents that defied logical explanation, and deeply philosophical essays exploring whether certain individuals might simply be born without the capacity for moral reasoning. The implications of Timothy Caldwell's case reverberated through the worlds of law, psychology, and ethics for decades after his disappearance. His ability to deceive trained physicians, ministers, and lawmen alike raised disturbing questions about the limits of psychiatric understanding. How could experts hope to measure sanity or rehabilitation in someone who could flawlessly imitate both? More troubling still, Timothy's manipulative genius forced society to reconsider its most comforting assumptions: that children were innocent by nature, and that evil was something acquired, not innate. The Caldwell farm, once the setting of domestic peace, became a place of whispered superstition and lingering dread. Though Thomas and Sarah Caldwell eventually recovered physically from their ordeal, neither could bring themselves to remain on the land that had harbored so much horror. They sold the property and vanished into anonymity, living under assumed names in distant towns, haunted by the fear that Timothy might one day return. Both died childless, Sarah in 1889, Thomas 5 years later in 1894, carrying their trauma in silence. The farmhouse fell into decay, and by the 1890s the land was taken over by the county and later sold to developers. Yet local residents continued to avoid it, insisting that the ground itself carried a shadow. The cave where Timothy had performed his gruesome experiments was sealed by Sheriff Crawford soon after the boy's capture. But even decades later, townsfolk swore that the surrounding area remained eerily lifeless, that animals refused to graze there, and that strange sounds echoed from beneath the earth on moonless nights. In 1923, Dr. Harding's daughter donated her father's journals to the Missouri Historical Society. Though she admitted that their contents were profoundly disturbing, she believed that the documents possessed immense scientific and historical value. To this day, the collection remains preserved in the Society's archives, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. Within those yellowed pages, scholars still find echoes of one of the most unsettling minds in recorded history. In his final journal entry, penned only days before his death in 1891, Dr. Harding wrote words that would forever define the enigma of Timothy Caldwell. "I have spent 24 years attempting to understand what he was, and I fear that I now know the answer. Timothy was not an aberration, he was a revelation, a glimpse into what humanity might become when stripped of conscience and compassion. If he still lives, then somewhere in America walks a man who understands human psychology better than any trained expert, who can manipulate with the ease of breathing, and who sees the rest of mankind as little more than subjects for his experiments. His words remain as chilling now as they were then. The story of Timothy Caldwell forces us to confront an unsettling possibility, that evil does not always wear a monstrous face, but can dwell behind the innocent eyes of a child. It challenges every comfortable belief about morality, empathy, and what it means to be human. Was Timothy merely the product of circumstance, or proof that some beings are born beyond redemption? The official record ends with his disappearance, but perhaps the true story never did. Some say he died in obscurity. Others whisper that he lived on, hidden behind new names, perfecting his craft. Whether fact or folklore, one truth remains. History often conceals its darkest secrets in plain sight, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those who learned long ago how to look human.